The 6-year-old boy clutched his father's coat sleeve. Fluorescent light from the convenience store cut across the parking lot, casting cold streaks on the wet asphalt. Marcus Thompson held his black credit card between his fingers, watching the young woman cradle her newborn baby beside a dumpster. She wore a torn jacket, her sneakers split at the seams, her breath forming thin clouds in the December air. "Daddy, that baby's really cold," Sophie whispered, her small voice barely audible over the hum of traffic. The smell of coffee from inside the store mixed with gasoline fumes, reminding Marcus of tomorrow morning's board meeting, where he would decide the fate of the affordable housing project that had been delayed for 6 months. "It's just procedure," Johnson's voice from the planning committee still echoed in his head. Marcus slipped the credit card into his vest pocket, leaving a warm streak on his cold palm. The car door closed with a soft click. Sophie followed closely behind her father, unaware that the boardroom discussion tomorrow would change the young mother's life forever. That night, someone deleted a line from the fourth quarter budget report. Marcus Thompson had learned to read numbers the way other people read faces. Tonight, staring at the quarterly report spread across his home office desk, the figures told a story he didn't want to hear. The Haven Heights affordable housing project, 18 months of planning, environmental studies, zoning approvals reduced to a single line item marked for review. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the framed photo beside his laptop. Sophie at last year's school carnival, cotton candy stuck to her cheek, laughing at something he couldn't remember now. The house felt too quiet without her weekend chatter. She was spending the night at her grandmother's, which meant Marcus could work late without feeling guilty about missing bedtime stories. His phone buzzed with the text from Richard Johnson, chairman of the development board. "Tomorrow's meeting moved to 9 a.m. Need to finalize Q4 allocations." The message felt heavier than it should have. Marcus closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. The black credit card sat on the counter where he'd left it after dinner, a Centurion card that carried more weight than money. It was a symbol, Johnson had said when the board approved Marcus's promotion to development director 6 months ago. "Shows people we're serious about investment." But serious investment, Marcus was learning, didn't always mean serious commitment to the communities they served. He picked up the card, feeling its solid weight, and slipped it into his wallet. Tomorrow he would present the board with 3 options for the downtown revitalization budget, and only one of them included funding for Haven Heights. The other 2 redirected those funds to projects with higher profit margins and fewer complications. Projects that didn't require navigating the messy realities of homeless shelters and transitional housing. The phone rang as he was turning off the lights. "Marcus?" "It's David Walsh." The chief financial officer's voice sounded strained. "I wanted to give you a heads up about tomorrow. Johnson's been asking questions about the Haven Heights numbers. Wants to know if we've explored all our options." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. David had been pushing for the affordable housing project from the beginning, had spent countless hours making the financial case for mixed-income development. If Johnson was pressuring David, it meant the decision had already been made. "What kind of questions?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The kind that sound like suggestions," David said quietly. "I'll see you tomorrow, Marcus. And thanks for everything you've done on this project. I know it matters to you." The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with the weight of what wasn't being said. He drove to the convenience store without really deciding to go anywhere. Sometimes movement helped him think, and tonight his thoughts felt trapped in the small space of his house. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few late commuters grabbing coffee and lottery tickets. As he pulled into a space near the entrance, he saw her, a young woman sitting on the curb beside the dumpster, rocking a bundle in her arms. Even from inside his car, he could see she was too young to be out here alone with a baby. Her jacket was thin against the December cold, and her sneakers had holes that would let in the rain. Marcus sat in his car for a moment, engine running, watching her sing something soft to the infant in her arms. The sight of her made something ache in his chest, not pity, exactly, but recognition. After his divorce 2 years ago, there had been nights when he'd felt almost that exposed, almost that uncertain about where he and Sophie would land. He got out of the car and walked toward the store, fishing the credit card from his wallet. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh after the dim parking lot, and the sudden warmth made his glasses fog. He grabbed a coffee and a package of crackers, then added a container of formula and a small blanket from the baby section. The clerk, a teenager with tired eyes, didn't comment on the unusual combination. When Marcus walked back outside, the young woman was still there, but now the baby was crying, a thin, desperate sound that cut through the traffic noise. "Excuse me," Marcus said, approaching slowly. "I thought you might need this." He held out the formula and blanket. She looked up at him, with eyes that were simultaneously grateful and wary. "Sarah," she said, accepting the items. "And this is Anna. She's 8 weeks old." Marcus introduced himself and learned that Sarah had been staying in her car until it broke down 3 days ago. She had been living in transitional housing, but the waiting list for permanent placement was 6 months long. "There's a shelter downtown," she said, "but they don't have room for babies right now. Too many families." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Tomorrow he would help decide whether to fund more spaces for families like Sarah's, or whether to redirect that money toward developments that would push families like hers further from the city center. As he drove home, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the way Sarah had looked at her daughter, with the kind of fierce protectiveness he recognized from his own experience as a single parent. The Haven Heights project would have created 40 units of affordable housing with on-site childcare and job training programs. Without it, families like Sarah's would keep falling through the cracks, pushed further from resources by developments that prioritized profit over people. Marcus knew Johnson would frame tomorrow's decision as a matter of fiscal responsibility, but sitting in his comfortable suburban home, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of Anna's crying. Some responsibilities, he thought, couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. The black credit card sat on his nightstand as he tried to fall asleep, its weight somehow heavier than it had been that morning. Marcus arrived at the office early, hoping to review the budget reports one more time before the board meeting. The development firm's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the neighborhood where Haven Heights was supposed to be built. From his office on the 15th floor, Marcus could see the vacant lot where families like Sarah's would eventually need somewhere to live. The irony felt deliberate, as if the building's architects had designed it to keep decision-makers physically elevated above the consequences of their choices. He spread the financial documents across his desk and began looking for inconsistencies, not because he expected to find fraud, but because he needed to understand exactly how the numbers were being presented to the board. The Haven Heights budget had been revised 3 times in the past month, each version showing slight modifications to the projected costs. Marcus pulled up the email chain between David Walsh and the construction contractors, looking for explanations for the changes. What he found instead raised questions he hadn't expected. The most recent contractor estimate included line items that hadn't appeared in earlier versions: additional environmental testing, expanded parking requirements, and infrastructure upgrades that seemed excessive for a 40-unit residential project. When Marcus called the contracting company to clarify, the project manager sounded surprised. "Those additional requirements came from your board, Mr. Thompson. We assumed you knew about the scope changes." Marcus did not know about the scope changes. More importantly, he couldn't find any board minutes documenting when those changes had been approved. He spent the next hour reviewing meeting records and email timestamps, building a timeline that didn't quite make sense. The additional requirements had been added to the Haven Heights budget the same week that Meridian Construction, a high-end firm specializing in luxury developments, had submitted an unsolicited proposal for the same downtown lot. Meridian's proposal was for a 60-unit mixed-use development with ground-floor retail and market-rate apartments starting at $2,500 per month. The proposal had been forwarded to Johnson by his assistant, but there was no record of it being discussed in any board meetings. Marcus made copies of both proposals and slipped them into a folder he labeled Q4 Review. He was beginning to suspect that Haven Heights wasn't being killed by budget constraints so much as by design. The security cameras in the building's lobby operated on a 30-day cycle, automatically deleting old footage to make room for new recordings. Marcus had learned this during the orientation training that all employees received, though he'd never expected the information to be relevant to his work. Today, he found himself wondering what conversations might have taken place in the building after hours, when the formal record-keeping stopped. He made a mental note to check whether any of the recent meetings had occurred outside normal business hours, and whether those meetings had been documented in official minutes. The thought made him uncomfortable. He was essentially investigating his own colleagues, but the number that's in front of him suggested that someone was manipulating the budget process to favor Meridian's proposal over Haven Heights. During his lunch break, Marcus drove back to the area where he'd met Sarah the night before. He told himself he was just checking on her, making sure she and Anna were safe, but he also needed to see the human face behind the budget numbers he'd been analyzing. He found her at a small park 6 blocks from the convenience store, sitting on a bench while Anna slept in a stroller that had seen better days. Sarah looked exhausted, but was trying to keep up with normal routines. She'd managed to find a place to shower and had washed Anna's blankets in a restroom sink. "How's the housing search going?" Marcus asked, sitting beside her on the bench. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "There's a waiting list for the waiting list," she said. 6 months if I'm lucky, maybe longer. And that's assuming I can prove stable income, which is hard to do when you don't have an address. Sarah explained the circular logic that trapped families like hers. You needed an address to get a job, but you needed a job to qualify for housing. The transitional shelter where she'd been staying had a 30-day limit, and her time had expired before permanent housing opened up. "There's supposed to be more affordable units opening downtown soon," she said. "Someone at the shelter mentioned a new development called Haven Heights. But they said it might not get built after all." Budget problems. Marcus felt something twist in his stomach. Sarah was talking about the very project he would help decide in a few hours. The woman who most needed Haven Heights to exist didn't even know that its fate was being debated by people who would never face the consequences of their decision. He wanted to tell her that he would fight for the project, but he wasn't sure he had enough influence to make a difference. Johnson controlled the board, and David Walsh seemed to be under pressure to support whatever Johnson recommended. As Marcus drove back to the office for the afternoon board meeting, he thought about the timeline he'd constructed from the budget documents. The additional requirements for Haven Heights had appeared within days of Meridian's unsolicited proposal, as if someone had been looking for reasons to make the affordable housing project less financially attractive. He couldn't prove intentional manipulation, but the pattern was suspicious enough to warrant questions. The problem was that asking those questions would require him to challenge Johnson directly in front of the full board, with evidence that might not be conclusive enough to change anyone's mind. Marcus had worked hard to build credibility within the organization, and he knew that making accusations he couldn't prove would damage his effectiveness on future projects. But as he thought about Sarah and Anna, he realized that his credibility wouldn't mean much if he used it to stay silent when speaking up might make a difference. The board meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock in the conference room on the 17th floor. As Marcus gathered his materials, he made a decision that surprised him. Instead of presenting Johnson's preferred budget options, he would present the questions he'd discovered about the Haven Heights cost increases. It might end his career with the development firm, but it would also ensure that the board made their decision with complete information. He tucked the folder of documents under his arm and headed for the elevator, unsure of what would happen next, but certain that he couldn't live with staying silent. The black credit card in his wallet felt heavier than ever, a reminder of the privilege that came with the responsibility to use it wisely. The boardroom on the 17th floor was designed to intimidate. A mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, including the downtown area where Haven Heights was supposed to be built. Richard Johnson sat at the head of the table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression that of a man accustomed to getting his way without having to explain himself. The other board members, 5 local business leaders and 2 city council liaisons, shuffled through their copies of the budget proposals as Marcus took his seat. He had decided during the elevator ride to present his questions diplomatically, framing them as requests for clarification rather than accusations of impropriety. Before we discuss the funding allocations, Marcus began, I wanted to ask about some changes to the Haven Heights cost projections. The most recent contractor estimates include several new requirements that weren't part of the original scope. He distributed copies of the timeline he'd created, showing the dates when various changes had been added to the budget. Johnson glanced at the documents with the expression of someone who had expected this conversation and had prepared for it. Those changes reflect a more thorough analysis of the project's actual requirements, Johnson said smoothly. When we dig deeper into these community development projects, we often discover complications that weren't apparent in the initial planning stages. The explanation sounded reasonable, but it didn't address Marcus's actual question about who had authorized the changes and when. David Walsh, the CFO, looked uncomfortable as the discussion continued. Marcus had expected David to support the questions about budget transparency, but instead David seemed to be avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. The contractor estimates are what they are, David said when Johnson prompted him to comment. We have to work with the numbers we're given. Something in David's tone suggested he was being careful about what he said, as if he were walking through a minefield of competing pressures. Marcus realized that David might be facing the same choice he was: speak up and risk professional consequences, or stay quiet and hope someone else would take the risk. The dynamic in the room was starting to feel less like a budget discussion and more like a power struggle with predetermined outcomes. Board member Patricia Mills, who represented the neighborhood association, raised her hand tentatively. I'm not a finance expert, she said, but these cost increases seem significant. Are we sure we're comparing apples to apples when we evaluate different projects? It was the opening Marcus had been hoping for. He pulled out the Meridian construction proposal that had been forwarded to Johnson the same week as the Haven Heights cost increases. That's actually an interesting question, Marcus said. I found this proposal for the same downtown lot, submitted around the same time as the revised Haven Heights estimates. It might be worth comparing the 2 projects to make sure we understand all our options. Johnson's expression tightened slightly, the first crack in his polished demeanor. Meridian's proposal was unsolicited, he said. We're not obligated to consider every development idea that comes across our desks. The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Marcus could feel the other board members looking back and forth between him and Johnson, trying to understand the subtext of their exchange. Of course not, Marcus said carefully. But since both projects target the same location and time frame, it seems worth understanding how their costs and timelines compare, especially given the questions about Haven Heights budgeting. Johnson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. Marcus, I appreciate your attention to detail, but I think you may be overthinking this. Budget revisions are normal in development work. What's important is that we make fiscally responsible decisions with taxpayer money. The phrase fiscally responsible was clearly meant to end the discussion, but Marcus had gone too far to back down now. I agree completely, Marcus said, which is why I think we should have Lisa Park from the legal department review both proposals to make sure we're following proper procurement procedures. Lisa Park was known for her meticulous attention to regulatory compliance, and she had no political loyalties within the development firm. Johnson's jaw tightened visibly. "That won't be necessary," he said. "Lisa's office is already overloaded with other projects." But Patricia Mills was nodding thoughtfully. "Actually, that sounds like a good idea," she said. "Given the community interest in this project, we should make sure we're crossing all our T's and dotting all our I's." Two other board members murmured agreement. Marcus felt a small surge of hope. He wasn't alone in wanting more transparency about the decision-making process. Johnson called for a 15-minute recess, ostensibly to allow board members to review the additional documents Marcus had distributed. As people filed out of the conference room, David Walsh approached Marcus with a worried expression. "Can we talk privately for a minute?" he asked. They walked to an empty office down the hall, where David closed the door and turned to face Marcus with an expression that was part gratitude and part concern. "I'm glad someone finally asked those questions," David said quietly. "But you need to know what you're getting into." Johnson has already made up his mind about Haven Heights. The board meeting is just for show, to make it look like we followed proper procedures. Marcus felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" David glanced toward the door, then pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a text message from 3 days earlier. "Look at the timestamp," he said. The message was from Johnson to David, sent at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Confirm final numbers for Friday board meeting. Need to close Haven Heights discussion and move on Q4 priorities." The message had been sent before Marcus had even compiled his questions about the budget revisions, before the board had reviewed any of the comparative analysis Marcus had requested. Johnson had decided to kill the affordable housing project before the discussion had officially begun. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" Marcus asked. David's expression was pained. "Because I have 2 kids in college and a mortgage," he said. "And because I hoped maybe you could find a way to change his mind that wouldn't require me to commit career suicide." Marcus understood the position David was in, but he also realized that staying silent would make him complicit in a decision that would affect families like Sarah's. "What if we both speak up?" Marcus asked. "What if we make it impossible for him to ignore the evidence?" David shook his head slowly. "Johnson doesn't ignore evidence, Marcus. He controls what evidence the board gets to see. The only question is whether you want to go down fighting or find a way to preserve your ability to influence future projects." As they walked back toward the conference room, Marcus found himself thinking about Sophie and the conversations they would have in a few years about integrity and moral courage. He wanted to be able to tell her that he had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. But he also wanted to keep his job so he could provide for her, the way a good father should. The competing pressures felt impossible to reconcile. Then he remembered Sarah in the park, talking about the circular logic that trapped families without stable housing. Maybe the real trap was thinking he had to choose between doing right and doing well. Maybe the choice was actually between short-term safety and long-term integrity. As the board reconvened, Marcus made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire meeting. Instead of backing down, he was going to double down and see where the truth led him. Lisa Park arrived at the board meeting with a banker's box full of files and a laptop computer. She was a contemplate woman in her 40s, with steel gray hair and the kind of methodical attention to detail that made her invaluable in complex legal reviews. Marcus had not actually expected Johnson to agree to bring her in, but Patricia Mills had made the request formal by calling for a board vote, and Johnson hadn't been able to refuse without seeming obstructionist. Now, Lisa was setting up at one end of the conference table, pulling out documents that Marcus recognized as property records, zoning files, and construction permits. "I've spent the last 2 hours reviewing both the Haven Heights proposal and the Meridian construction submission," she said without preamble. "There are some interesting discrepancies that the board should be aware of." Lisa opened her laptop and projected a timeline onto the wall screen. "The Haven Heights project has been in development for 18 months, with all major permits approved and contractors selected through competitive bidding. The Meridian proposal, by contrast, was submitted without any competitive bidding process and includes several elements that would require zoning variances that haven't been applied for. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a side-by-side comparison of the two projects' specifications. More significantly, the recent cost increases for Haven Heights appear to be based on requirements that would only be necessary if the project scope had changed from affordable housing to market-rate development. The additional parking structures, luxury amenities, and expanded retail spaces that drove up the Haven Heights budget are actually features of the Meridian proposal. The room was completely silent. Marcus felt his pulse quickening as he realized what Lisa was suggesting. The Haven Heights budget hadn't been inflated by legitimate cost overruns. It had been inflated by incorporating requirements from an entirely different project. Someone had systematically made the affordable housing project look financially unfeasible by adding costs that would only make sense for a luxury development. "Are you saying someone deliberately sabotaged the Haven Heights numbers?" Patricia Mills asked. Lisa's expression remained professionally neutral, but her next slide made the manipulation clear. "I'm saying that the cost increases don't match the project specifications, and the timing suggests a pattern that warrants further investigation." Johnson had been unusually quiet throughout Lisa's presentation, but now he leaned forward with the kind of controlled anger that Marcus had never seen from him before. "This is highly inappropriate," Johnson said, his voice tight. "Lisa, you were asked to review procurement procedures, not to make accusations about the integrity of our budget process." Lisa didn't flinch. "I was asked to ensure compliance with procurement regulations," she said calmly. "Compliance requires that we can document how budget decisions were made and by whom. The Haven Heights file doesn't contain that documentation." She clicked to another slide showing email timestamps and authorization signatures. In fact, several of the cost modifications appear to have been made without proper authorization procedures. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had suspected that Johnson was manipulating the budget process, but he hadn't realized the extent of the deception. Johnson wasn't just favoring one project over another. He was actively sabotaging the affordable housing project to justify redirecting public funds to a private development that would benefit his preferred contractors. The realization made Marcus angry in a way he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about budget allocations or development priorities. It was about using public resources to benefit private interests, while families like Sarah's were pushed further from stable housing. "What's the legal exposure here?" Marcus asked. Lisa's expression grew more serious. "If public funds are being redirected without proper authorization, that could constitute misappropriation. At minimum, it violates the procurement transparency requirements for projects involving federal housing grants." David Walsh, who had been silent throughout Lisa's presentation, finally spoke up. "I want to clarify something for the record," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "The cost modifications that Lisa is questioning were not initiated by my office. They were forwarded to me with instructions to incorporate them into the budget projections, but I did not authorize or approve them." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "I have copies of all the communications regarding these changes, including the instructions about how they should be presented to the board." Johnson's face was now noticeably flushed. "David, I think you're misremembering." "No," David interrupted, with more force than Marcus had ever heard from him. "I'm not misremembering, and I'm not going to let my name be associated with budget manipulation." The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Johnson, who had controlled every board meeting Marcus had attended, was now on the defensive. The other board members were looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion. Patricia Mills was taking notes, clearly preparing to ask follow-up questions. The city council liaisons were exchanging glances that suggested they would be reporting back to their offices about what they had witnessed. Marcus realized that the meeting had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about choosing between two development projects, but about whether the board could trust its own decision-making process. Johnson seemed to realize the same thing. "I think we need to table this discussion," he said, standing up from his chair. "These accusations are serious, and they require a more thorough review than we can conduct in a single meeting." "Actually," Lisa said, still seated and still projecting documents onto the wall screen, "I think the board needs to see one more thing before we adjourn." She clicked to a slide showing a bank routing number and account information. The Meridian construction proposal includes a unique project identifier that connects to a specific funding account. That identifier appears in several of the Haven Heights cost modifications, suggesting that someone was preparing to transfer the Haven Heights budget to the Meridian project. Marcus felt the room go cold. Lisa had found not just evidence of budget manipulation, but evidence of financial preparation for redirecting public funds to a private contractor. The implications were staggering. Johnson was no longer just manipulating budget presentations. He appeared to be setting up actual fund transfers. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Patricia Mills spoke. "Richard, I think you need to step down from chairing this meeting while we sort this out." Johnson looked around the table, perhaps hoping to find support from other board members. But the expressions he saw offered no comfort. Even his longtime allies seemed shaken by the evidence Lisa had presented. "This is mistake," Johnson said quietly. "You're all making a terrible mistake." But as he gathered his papers and left the conference room, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, but sadness. Johnson's actions had been wrong, but watching a man's career implode in real time was still painful. The cost of integrity, Marcus realized, was often higher than anyone anticipated. As the emergency board session continued past dinner time, Marcus thought about Sarah and Anna, probably settling in for another cold night without permanent shelter. The Haven Heights project could still be saved, but even if it moved forward immediately, it would be months before families could move in. The damage that had been done, not just to the housing project, but to public trust in the development process, would take much longer to repair. But for the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like he could look at himself in the mirror. He had chosen integrity over convenience, and whatever came next, he would face it with a clear conscience. The emergency board meeting ran until nearly midnight, but it was only the beginning of what Marcus knew would be a much longer process. Patricia Mills had been elected temporary chairwoman, and she had immediately called for a comprehensive audit of all projects that Johnson had overseen during the past 2 years. Lisa Park was put in charge of the investigation, with full access to financial records, email archives, and contractor communications. Marcus volunteered to coordinate with the city council liaisons to ensure that all regulatory agencies were informed about the irregularities that had been discovered. It felt strange to be working this late in the office building, with most of the floors dark and empty, but the urgency of the situation demanded immediate action. David Walsh stayed late to help Lisa organize the financial documentation they would need for the audit. As they worked through boxes of contracts and budget reports, David explained how the pressure had built over the past several months. "Johnson started asking questions about Haven Heights back in August," David said, pulling out a file folder thick with correspondence. "At first, it seemed like normal due diligence making. Sure, we understood all the costs and timeline issues. But then he started suggesting modifications that didn't make sense for an affordable housing project. When I questioned them, he said the board wanted to explore all options before making a final commitment." Marcus realized that Johnson had been laying the groundwork for killing Haven Heights much longer than anyone had suspected. The manipulation hadn't been a sudden decision, but a careful campaign designed to make the affordable housing project appear financially irresponsible. Lisa discovered that the pattern extended beyond just Haven Heights. 3 other community development projects had been subject to similar cost inflation over the past 18 months, all of them subsequently cancelled due to budget constraints. But in each case, the cancelled project had been replaced by a market-rate development that generated higher profits for contractors and developers. "This isn't just about one housing project," Lisa said, showing Marcus a spreadsheet that tracked the pattern across multiple projects. "This appears to be a systematic effort to redirect community development funds toward private development interests." The scale of the problem was larger than Marcus had imagined, affecting not just families like Sarah's, but entire neighborhoods that had been counting on affordable housing, community centers, and public infrastructure improvements. Marcus spent the early morning hours calling community leaders and housing advocates to inform them about what the board had discovered. The conversations were difficult because he couldn't make promises about which projects might be restored or when construction might begin. But he could promise transparency about the decision-making process, and he could assure people that their voices would be heard as the board worked to clean up the mess that Johnson had created. Sarah was one of the hardest calls to make, because Marcus had to explain that Haven Heights was back on track, but still months away from opening. "At least there's hope now," Sarah said, when Marcus reached her at a temporary shelter where she and Anna had found space for a few nights. "That's more than we had yesterday." The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and document reviews. Marcus found himself working closely with Lisa Park to understand the full extent of Johnson's manipulations, and he was impressed by her methodical approach to building an airtight case. "The key is to focus on the documentation," Lisa explained as they reviewed email chains and financial records. "We can't prove intent, but we can prove that proper procedures weren't followed and that public funds were redirected without appropriate authorization. That's enough to warrant criminal investigation, and it's certainly enough to justify reversing the budget decisions that were based on manipulated information." Marcus was learning more about municipal law and procurement regulations than he had ever expected, but the education was necessary to ensure that the board's corrective actions would hold up under scrutiny. The hardest part of the process was dealing with the media attention that began as word leaked out about the investigation. Marcus had never been comfortable with public speaking, and he found himself thrust into the role of unofficial spokesperson for the board's reform efforts. Reporters wanted to know how such extensive manipulation had gone undetected for so long, and Marcus struggled to answer that question without sounding defensive or naive. "The system depends on trust," he said during one particularly challenging interview. "When someone in a position of authority violates that trust, it takes time to discover the extent of the damage. What matters now is that we're committed to transparency and accountability going forward." He hoped that was true, but he also knew that rebuilding public trust would require more than good intentions. Sophie noticed that her father was working longer hours and seemed more stressed than usual. "Are you okay, Daddy?" she asked one evening, as Marcus was reviewing budget documents at the kitchen table after dinner. Marcus looked at his daughter and tried to figure out how to explain the situation in terms she could understand. "I'm working on a problem at the office," he said. "Someone wasn't being honest about important decisions, and now we have to fix the things that went wrong." Sophie considered this seriously. Like when Tommy cheated on the math test, and Mrs. Peterson had to make the whole class retake it. The comparison was more accurate than Marcus had expected. Yes, something like that. Sometimes when one person doesn't follow the rules, it affects a lot of other people. As the week progressed, Marcus began to see signs that their efforts were making a difference. The City Council voted unanimously to restore funding for the 3 canceled community development projects, including Haven Heights. The State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into the budget irregularities, and several other municipalities reported similar patterns in their own development programs. Most importantly for Marcus, He received word that Haven Heights construction could begin within 6 weeks, meaning that families would be able to move into the first units by late spring. It wasn't soon enough to help Sarah and Anna immediately, but it was progress toward ensuring that other families wouldn't face the same challenges. The work was far from over, but Marcus was beginning to believe that the system could be reformed if enough people were willing to fight for transparency and accountability. On Friday evening, as Marcus was finally leaving the office at a reasonable hour for the first time in a week, he encountered Johnson in the parking garage. The former board chairman looked older and more tired than Marcus had ever seen him, but his expression was calm rather than angry. "I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished," Johnson said quietly. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face him. "I'm not happy about any of this, Richard. I wish it hadn't been necessary." Johnson nodded slowly. "The thing is, Marcus, you probably saved my career by stopping me when you did. Another year of this, and I would have crossed lines I couldn't come back from. So maybe I should be thanking you." It was not the conversation Marcus had expected to have, and it left him with complicated feelings about justice, accountability, and the human cost of doing what was right. The community meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the high school auditorium, chosen because it was the largest public venue available, and because the school was accessible by public transportation. Marcus had never spoken to a crowd of more than 50 people, but tonight, he estimated that nearly 300 community members had gathered to hear the board's report on the investigation and their plans for moving forward. The stage lights were bright enough that he couldn't see individual faces in the audience, but he could feel the weight of their attention and their expectations. Patricia Mills, now the permanent board chairwoman, introduced the evening's agenda and explained that the meeting was being recorded to ensure transparency and accountability. Marcus took the podium with a folder full of documents and a profound sense of responsibility. 6 weeks ago, this board discovered that public funds designated for affordable housing and community development had been systematically redirected to benefit private development interests, Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "Tonight, I want to explain exactly what happened, how we discovered it, and what we're doing to make sure it never happens again." He had practiced this presentation dozens of times, but speaking to the actual community felt different than rehearsing in front of colleagues. These were the people whose lives had been affected by Johnson's manipulations, families who had been waiting for affordable housing, small business owners who had been counting on community development grants, and neighborhood groups that had seen their advocacy efforts undermined by corruption. Marcus used a PowerPoint presentation to walk through the timeline of Johnson's budget manipulations, showing how the Haven Heights project had been systematically sabotaged through inflated cost projections and unauthorized scope changes. He explained how Lisa Park's legal review had revealed the extent of the financial irregularities, and how the emergency board session had led to Johnson's resignation and the restoration of funding for canceled community projects. The audience was quiet during the technical explanation, but Marcus could sense their growing anger as they understood how their trust had been betrayed. When he reached the slide showing the Meridian construction proposal and its connection to the Haven Heights budget modifications, several people called out questions that he couldn't quite hear over the auditorium's acoustics. "I know many of you have been personally affected by these delays," Marcus continued, moving to the heart of what he wanted to communicate. "Families have been displaced, small businesses have lost opportunities, and community organizations have had their plans disrupted. No amount of explanation can undo that harm, but we can ensure that it doesn't happen again." He clicked to a slide showing the new oversight procedures the board had implemented. All budget modifications would require approval from at least 3 board members. All contractor proposals would go through competitive bidding, and all meetings involving public funds would be recorded and made available to the public. More importantly, the board was establishing a community advisory committee with rotating membership to ensure that affected residents would have direct input into development decisions. The question and answer session that followed was intense, but productive. A woman in the third row stood up to ask about the timeline for Haven Heights construction, and Marcus was able to give her specific dates. Groundbreaking would begin in 2 weeks, and the first families would be able to move in by April. An elderly man near the back asked about the other canceled projects, and Patricia Mills explained that the community center and job training facility would also be restored, with construction beginning in the spring. The questions were pointed, but not hostile. These were people who wanted accountability, not revenge. Marcus found himself thinking about the difference between our justice and vengeance, and how important it was to focus on solutions rather than punishment. The most emotional moment came when Sarah stood up in the middle section of the auditorium. Marcus recognized her immediately, though she looked different than she had in the park, more confident, more hopeful. "I just wanted to thank the board for doing the right thing," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone someone had passed to her. "My daughter and I have been waiting for housing for 8 months, and I know there are a lot of other families in the same situation. It means everything to know that Haven Heights is going to happen, and that people fought to make sure it wasn't canceled." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. "I also wanted to say that sometimes the most important changes start with just one person being willing to ask questions when something doesn't seem right." As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions. The investigation had succeeded in exposing corruption and restoring funding for important community projects. But the process had also revealed how fragile democratic institutions could be when key individuals abused their authority. The applause from the audience was gratifying, but Marcus knew that the real measure of success would be whether families like Sarah's actually got the help they needed. The community had been betrayed by someone they had trusted, and rebuilding that trust would require consistent follow-through on the promises the board was making. Marcus packed up his presentation materials and shook hands with dozens of community members as they filed out of the auditorium, each conversation a reminder of the human stakes behind municipal budget decisions. Lisa Park approached Marcus as the crowd was dispersing, carrying a briefcase full of documents that represented weeks of investigative work. "The State Attorney General's office wants to meet with us Monday morning," she said. "They're considering criminal charges related to the fund diversions, and they need our cooperation to build the case." Marcus nodded, though the prospect of testifying in a criminal trial felt daunting. "Whatever it takes," he said. "We've come this far, and the community deserves to see this through to the end." Lisa smiled the first time Marcus had seen her look genuinely optimistic since the investigation began. "I think we've got a good case," she said. "And more importantly, I think we've sent a clear message that this kind of corruption won't be tolerated." The drive home took Marcus past the vacant lot, where Haven Heights would be built, and he stopped for a moment to look at the construction signs that had been installed earlier that day. In the spring, this empty space would become home to 40 families, with on-site childcare and job training programs that could help people like Sarah build stable, independent lives. The project wasn't just about housing, it was about creating opportunities for people to escape the cycle of poverty and displacement that trapped so many families. Marcus thought about Sophie, who would be 7 years old when Haven Heights opened, and about the conversations they would have about civic responsibility and moral courage. He wanted her to grow up understanding that democracy required active participation from ordinary citizens, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was ask questions when something didn't seem right. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he realized that his black credit card was still in his wallet, the same card that had felt so heavy with symbolic weight 6 weeks ago. Tonight, it felt like what it actually was, a piece of plastic that could buy things, but couldn't buy integrity. The real currency of leadership, Marcus had learned, was the willingness to risk comfort for the sake of doing what was right. It was a lesson that had cost him some sleepless nights and considerable stress, But it was also a lesson he was glad to have learned while he still had the chance to act on it. Tomorrow, he would start the process of implementing the new oversight procedures the board had promised. And he would begin the long work of rebuilding public trust in local government. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. 3 months later, Marcus stood in the parking lot of the same convenience store where this entire journey had begun. The March air was warmer than that December night, and the fluorescent lights seemed less harsh somehow, more welcoming than forbidding. Sophie was with him this time, clutching a $20 bill she had earned from doing extra chores, excited about buying Easter candy for the community celebration at Haven Heights. The first 20 families had moved into the new housing complex 2 weeks earlier, and the grand opening celebration was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Marcus had been invited to speak at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, though he planned to keep his remarks brief and focus on thanking the community members who had made the project possible. Sarah approached them from across the parking lot, pushing Anna in a new stroller and carrying a bag of groceries. She looked transformed from the desperate young woman Marcus had encountered 4 months ago. Not just because she had stable housing now, but because she radiated the kind of confidence that came from having agency over her own life. "Marcus! Sophie!" she called out, waving as she approached. Anna was 8 months old now, alert and curious about the world around her, reaching for Sophie's brightly colored jacket when they got close enough. "How are you settling in?" Marcus asked, though he could see from Sarah's demeanor that the transition had gone well. "It's like a dream," Sarah said, her voice full of genuine happiness. "Anna has her own room, and I'm starting the job training program next week. They have childcare right on site, so I don't have to worry about transportation or finding someone to watch her." Sophie, who had heard the story of how her father had helped save Haven Heights, was fascinated by meeting Anna in person. "She's so much bigger than when Daddy first saw her," Sophie observed, offering the baby a small stuffed rabbit she had brought along. "Daddy says babies grow really fast when they're safe and warm." Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the simple, profound truth of Sophie's statement. "That's exactly right," Sarah said. "Babies grow better when they're safe and warm, and grown-ups do too." Marcus felt a lump in his throat as he watched the interaction between his daughter and the family, whose life had been changed by the decision to ask hard questions about budget allocations and municipal transparency. The convenience store had become something of a landmark in the neighborhood since the Haven Heights story had made news. The owner, a Korean immigrant named Mr. Kim, had started an informal job board near the entrance where community members could post opportunities for part-time work, childcare, and skills exchange. Marcus had learned that Mr. Kim had been quietly helping families like Sarah's for years, sometimes letting people take necessities on credit when they were between paychecks, sometimes offering cash-paying jobs to people who couldn't provide the documentation required by larger employers. He never made a big deal about it, Sarah explained as they walked toward the store entrance. "But when I was sleeping in my car, he was one of the few people who treated me like a human being, instead of a problem to be solved." Inside the store, Marcus bought coffee and pastries, while Sophie carefully selected her Easter candy. The black credit card felt different in his hand now, not heavy with symbolic weight, but simply useful for its intended purpose of making purchases. The transformation wasn't in the card itself, of course, but in Marcus's understanding of what privilege meant and how it should be used. Having access to resources created responsibility to use those resources ethically, but it also created opportunities to amplify other people's voices and support community-driven solutions to systemic problems. Marcus had learned that individual charity, while important, was no substitute for institutional change that addressed root causes of inequality and displacement. As they were leaving the store, Marcus noticed a new family sitting on the same curb where he had first encountered Sarah and Anna. A young father was holding a toddler, while a woman who appeared to be his wife sorted through papers that looked like housing applications and social services forms. Marcus felt the familiar tug of recognition and concern, but this time he also felt something that hadn't been there 4 months ago: confidence that there were systems in place to help them. The Haven Heights community coordinator made regular visits to local businesses and public spaces, connecting families with resources and helping them navigate the application process for housing assistance. The Community Advisory Committee had created a network of mutual support that extended well beyond the boundaries of any single development project. Sophie noticed the family too and tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, should we help them?" she asked quietly. Marcus smiled at his daughter's instinctive compassion and her assumption that helping was both possible and necessary. "Let's start by saying hello," Marcus suggested. "Sometimes that's the most important thing, making sure people know they're not invisible." They approached the young family and learned that they had been displaced from their apartment when their building had been sold to developers who were converting rental units to condominiums. The pattern was depressingly familiar, but the response resources were much better than they had been 6 months earlier. Marcus was able to give them the contact information for the Haven Heights community coordinator and for several other housing advocates who had emerged from the coalition that had formed during the investigation. The drive home took them past the construction site where the second phase of Haven Heights was already underway. The community center was beginning to take shape, with walls framed and a roof structure that would soon house the child care facility, job training programs, and community meeting spaces that had been part of the original vision. Marcus parked for a moment so they could watch the construction workers, and Sophie pressed her face to the car window to get a better view. "Will there be a playground?" she asked. "A big one," Marcus confirmed. "And a community garden where families can grow their own vegetables, and a computer lab where people can take classes." Sophie considered this seriously. "That sounds like a good place for kids to grow up," she said. "Better than sleeping in cars." As they continued home, Marcus thought about the conversation he had had with Patricia Mills the day before about his role in the ongoing oversight of community development projects. The board had asked him to consider accepting a promotion to Deputy Director of Community Development, a position that would give him more authority to ensure that future projects that served community needs rather than developer profits. The job would come with additional responsibilities and longer hours, but it would also give him the platform to implement the kind of systemic changes that could prevent another Johnson-style manipulation of public resources. Marcus had asked for time to discuss the opportunity with Sophie, because the decision would affect both of their lives. "Daddy," Sophie said as they pulled into their driveway, "I'm proud of you for helping that baby and her mom." The simple statement hit Marcus harder than all the formal recognition he had received from city officials and community organizations. This was what mattered: being the kind of person his daughter could respect, and teaching her through example that ordinary people had the power and responsibility to stand up for what was right. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart," Marcus said, "for caring about people who need help, and for asking good questions about how we can make things better." As they walked toward their front door, Sophie still clutching her Easter candy and Marcus carrying the coffee that had become a ritual reminder of that December night, he realized that the credit card in his wallet would never again feel like a burden. It was simply a tool, like any other, that could be used wisely or poorly depending on the values and priorities of the person who carried it. That evening, as Sophie slept peacefully in her own bed in their warm, secure home, Marcus made his decision about the job offer. He would accept the promotion and the additional responsibilities that came with it, because he had learned that privilege unused was privilege wasted. The community had invested their trust in him, and he had an obligation to use his position to ensure that families like Sarah's would continue to have advocates within the system. It wouldn't be easy work, and there would certainly be other Richard Johnsons who would test his resolve and his principles. But Marcus had discovered something important about himself over the past 4 months. When the choice came down to comfort versus integrity, he could choose integrity and live with the consequences. The fluorescent lights of the convenience store parking lot had illuminated more than just that December night. They had revealed the kind of person Marcus wanted to be, and the kind of world he wanted his daughter to inherit.